Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. My name is Natasha Overdoon and I will be moderating, and this is a re-record of the original session which took place on January 15. But we had some technical difficulties, and so we're re-recording because we did commit to making sure these sessions are available after the fact. On the 15th we had a lot of active discussion, some great questions, so we'll bring some of this forward. And as per usual, we also have an accompanying summary document which will include some of those questions that we won't get to today. So very briefly, I'll just share a few opening comments. First of all, this webinar is the second in our 2017-2018 Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series. And on the 15th, we had nearly 200 people participate, and all of us were drawn together by our interest and experience in Indigenous-led water governance and co-governance approaches. And I think what's recognized in this concept of collaborative consent that we'll be discussing today is that there are many different pathways and options for government to engage in water governance, and they're not mutually exclusive. So our speakers will be sharing an overview of the collaborative consent concept and its hallmarks, but we'll also hear about the innovative methods used by the Indigenous Law Research Unit to engage with communities to help revitalize Indigenous laws, legal institutions, and legal processes. Collaborative consent, I should mention, is a concept that is evolving, and so the thinking that is being shared today is intended to open up a dialogue, shake up our thinking, stir up debate, and this is a good learning opportunity for all of us. I should also note that we see this webinar as part of as the first part of a two-part series, today really hearing kind of initially about the concepts, but we would like to organize a follow-up session where we can hear directly from some of the communities and initiatives who are working on water governance and on revitalization of their laws. And we wouldn't be able to carry out this session without the support of our various partners, and all of them are listed here on the slide. A particular thanks to the Sitka Foundation, the Real Estate Foundation of BC, and Environment and Climate Change Canada for making this possible, and a thanks to our institutional partners at University of Victoria and also the Forum for Leadership on Water. I'll quickly introduce today's speakers. You might already know them, but first we have Rosie Sims and Michael Miltenberger, who are two out of the four co-authors on the collaborative consent discussion paper. And Rosie Sims is my counterpart in Victoria. She's the POLIS Water Sustainability Project Water Law and Policy Researcher and Project Manager. Rosie holds an MA from the Institute of Resources, Environment and Sustainability at the University of BC. And her work has taken her from Panama to the Canadian Arctic. She focuses on water governance, resource management, and Indigenous governance and rights. And Michael Miltenberger is the principal of North Raven. His interests are in water protection and governance, working collaboratively on environmental protection, renewable energy development, building efficient government, expediting land claims. And prior to his current work, he spent 20 years as MLA in the Northwest Territories Legislature, 14 of those years as Minister of the Environment and Natural Resources, Minister of Finance, Minister of Health and Social Services, and the Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Power Corporation. So he has a lot of experience to offer and a lot of insights around how governments can actually work together collaboratively. Finally, we have Simon Owen with us, and Simon has practiced Canadian law in Coast Salish, Tsimshian, Gitxsan, Niska, Six Nations, Inuit, and Anishinaabe-Aski territories, mostly in the areas of criminal defense and Indian Act band governance. He is now a senior researcher with the Indigenous Law Research Unit, and he'll be telling us more about his work with Indigenous communities to recover, revitalize, and reintegrate Indigenous legal traditions to their place at the heart of safe and self-governing nations. So thank you to all three of you for being here and for sharing your thoughts and your time, and we look forward to your presentation.
Great, thanks so much for that introduction, Natasha. And hello again, everyone. It's good to be back. So in today's presentation, Michael and I are going to be walking through some work that POLIS in partnership with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources, recently did on this concept of collaborative consent and moving towards watershed governance in British Columbia and beyond. So just briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with our two organizations, POLIS, again, is based here at the University of Victoria, and we're an applied research group really with a focus on watershed law, governance, and applied public policy. CEIR, which is the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources, is a national First Nation-directed organization that supports Indigenous communities directly in addressing their environmental priorities. So this is just a quick overview of our presentation today. We'll start with giving a bit of background and an orientation to the Collaborative Consent Research Project, so just sharing some of our motivations for doing this work and introduce our team and our approach. And then we'll walk briefly through some of the changing legal and political context in BC and Canada and share some of the key drivers for new approaches to governance for water and beyond. We'll give a rundown of the concept of collaborative consent, sort of the 101 edition. We'll walk through some of the identified hallmarks of this approach and illustrate with examples, including drawing on Michael's expertise and experience in the NWT. And I'll give a very quick look at how we think this approach could work in the context of BC's Water Sustainability Act. So with that, Michael, I'll hand it over to you just to help set the stage.
Good morning. So the question, the big broad question is, why are we having this discussion? 151 years since Confederation, we've figured out how to do cooperative federalism with the provinces, territories, and the federal government. What we haven't figured out is how to, in fact, engage in a similar process with Indigenous governments who stand marginalized on the governance sidelines. There is the systems in place that protect and maintain the status quo are heavily entrenched and defended in almost every Department of Justice in every government across Canada as we try to make the changes necessary. There's a window of opportunity here with the federal government that's in power right now, with their commitment to UNDRIP, to nation, to, in fact, implementing the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations. So the challenge is, how do we take advantage of that opportunity and move forward so that we can, in fact, bring Indigenous governments along so that they're no longer marginalized and that cooperative federalism, which has very many characteristics of collaborative consent, becomes applied across the land. So the big fundamental question, of course, is how do you make it work where there's overlap, where there's a whole different approaches after all these years, different legal systems, and the fact that Indigenous people are not seen on the same level as other governments at this point, even though that is what the goal is. So what we're going to lay out today is some thoughts on how to make that work. Rosie? Great,
thanks, Michael. And I'll maybe just add to this that in particular we wanted to explore the question on the slide here in relation to co-governance for water between Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments. So as I mentioned, this project emerged as a joint initiative between POLIS and CEIR, and it really builds on our ongoing work and some of the collective lived experience we've had, both working on watershed governance and Indigenous initiatives in BC, the Northwest Territories, and beyond. So from the POLIS side of things, and that's Oliver Brandeis and myself, a major impetus for us in doing this work was to provide some more depth and direction to our ongoing work around watershed governance, and in particular to kind of flesh out this identified winning condition of co-governance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous nations. From the CEIR side of things, Marilyn Fair and Michael together have a whole lot of experience as decision makers and negotiators in land and water negotiations in the NWT, and that includes in the Mackenzie River Basin bilateral agreements with BC and Alberta. And I just want to acknowledge that the concept of collaborative consent and this term was presented in a 2016 paper by Marilyn and Michael, which was called Collaborative Consent, a Nation-to-Nation Path to Partnership with Indigenous Governments. And so what we really did was to join forces to develop this 2017 discussion paper with the purpose of elaborating on the concept of collaborative consent that's been developed in the NWT context, and then taking it and seeing how it could apply in the BC freshwater context. And so we did our research over about a year-long span, and we tested the ideas with a number of different scholars and practitioners along the way. And as Natasha mentioned, I just want to highlight as well that this is very much a discussion paper, and so it's building on a concept that's been in development and continues to evolve for a number of years, and we certainly expect that it'll continue to be developed in further depth as we go forward. I guess I really want to emphasize that what we've laid out in this paper is not intended to be prescriptive, or we're not implying that this is the only way forward, but really it's intended to spark some further thinking on co-governance, and again acknowledging that different communities are going to choose how they best move forward in this governance space. And I guess just as a very recent example of how we've sort of refined the idea, we just updated the title of the paper this past month. It went from Collaborative Consent and BC's Water to Collaborative Consent and Water in BC, just to make it really clear that we are not inferring that the province of BC has exclusive ownership over freshwater and that that's very problematic, but instead we're referring to the geographic area of the province itself. So I just wanted to give a quick bird's eye view of some of the changing legal and governance context in which the collaborative consent work is taking place. And of course, a very important part about the discussion about Indigenous rights and decision-making is Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, which recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. And through case law, the courts have held that Section 35 is very much grounded in the honor of the Crown and creates a duty to consult and accommodate potential or established Aboriginal or treaty rights where a proposed activity could adversely impact those rights. There's been a lot of case law around Section 35, and I will not go into detail, but just point to a key case in BC, which is the 2015 Chilcotin decision, which stated that where Aboriginal title exists, governments and others seeking to use the land must obtain the consent of the Aboriginal title holders or prove the justification for proceeding without consent. So courts are affirming that decision-making without the consent of Indigenous nations does come at a high cost and bear significant risk. In parallel, and I think Simon will really help elaborate on this piece, Indigenous nations are articulating and advancing their own Indigenous laws for freshwater. And so how Indigenous law and colonial law interface and interact and inform one another really remains an outstanding question, but will certainly impact how water is governed moving forward. And the last point here is that there's plenty of evidence out there that Canada's current governance systems and institutions and relationships with Indigenous people continue to be marked by conflict and racism and inequality. And this manifests in many areas, including in resource and water-related decision-making, and this includes widespread dissatisfaction with the current approach to consultation and accommodation.
So, Rosie, if I could just quickly add a comment about Section 35. It is the fundamental foundational approach that governments now have in dealing with Indigenous governments. It implies very clearly that there is going to be an infringement of rights, and once that infringement is determined, then there's an obligation to consult after the fact and possibly accommodate. It does not include any Indigenous governments in the front end of the process, and is the reason why there are such widespread governance problems that you just articulated. And that's the issue of where the change is needed.
Yes, thanks, Michael, for adding that, and I think we'll circle back to that point in a few slides down the road here as well. Of course, one of the key drivers for new governance approaches in Canada currently is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, and Canada announced its full support and intention to implement UNDRIP back in May of 2016. The declaration has 46 provisions, and they're wide-ranging. The document is intended to be read as a whole, but I just wanted to pull out one of the key provisions here related to governance of land and water, and that is Article 32.2, which states that states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands and territories and other resources. So this really sets the stage for a very fundamentally different approach to decision-making for land and water. And I just wanted to share that in recent years, governments at all levels in Canada have stated their commitments to reconciliation and building nation-to-nation approaches, in part through the framework of UNDRIP. And I just wanted to share some of these statements and commitments here. So in 2015, our Prime Minister released the statement that it's time for Canada to have a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples. based on recognition, rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. In addition to announcing its full support for UNDRIP in 2016, the federal government has also accepted all of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and that includes the call for all levels of government to adopt and implement UNDRIP as a framework for reconciliation. In 2017, British Columbia's provincial government also stated its commitment to implementing UNDRIP and to governing BC according to UNDRIP's principles. Also in 2016, the federal justice minister announced the Liberal government support for Bill C-262, and this calls for the alignment of Canadian laws with the UN Declaration. So in a nutshell, this is a very complex and evolving conversation, but the bottom line is that it's a very clear stated priority for our governments at all levels to advance down the path of reconciliation, and in part through the framework of UNDRIP. And there is, again, a very complex and contested discussion about what UNDRIP truly means and how it will be implemented in Canada. But what we propose is that collaborative consent provides one pathway to deliver on these commitments to action, and that water is a key place to begin to apply this new approach. Did you want to add anything here, Michael?
Just to restate, Rosie, the issue that we have figured out one of the best systems in the world in terms of our cooperative federalism, and the hallmarks of that and the hallmarks of what we're being proposed under collaborative consent are very similar, if not identical. So we're not talking about reinventing the wheel here. This is how do you just translate that particular process to the Indigenous governments that are currently on the sidelines of the governance discussion.
Thanks, Michael. So what actually is this thing that we're calling collaborative consent? In a nutshell, it's a mutual consent process through which Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments commit to working together with a goal of achieving each other's consent, whether that's decisions, policies, laws, or plans. So it's fundamentally about governance and changing how decisions at all levels are made. We talk about collaborative consent as an outlook, so the outlook that partners are coming to the table with this very deep commitment to mutual consent and not proceeding over the disagreement of their partners. We talk about it as a process of long-term engagement and collaboration in decision-making that spans from planning to negotiation to implementation. And it's also an outcome. It's an outcome of co-governance. Two nations are not truly co-governing unless they're actually obtaining each other's consent on the important decisions along the way. This is a really important point on the slide here, and that's that collaborative consent doesn't mean that all parties are involved in each other's decisions all the time, but that together they decide how they're going to work together, so where they need to collaborate and where things may need to remain separate. And another key piece here is what we've described through the metaphor of bending the beams. And what this is referring to is that collaborative consent does require both parties to adjust. And so Crown and Indigenous governments will need to adapt their institutions, governance regimes, timelines to really create shared spaces to deal with the problems and the shared concerns at hand.
Rosie, if
Michael,
I
anything to add? Yeah.
Just a quick comment on the bending the beams, the key. I just want to emphasize the point of both Indigenous and Crown governance have to adjust, because the systems that are currently in place that have evolved over the last 151 years are really hidebound and preventing any kind of real movement on the move towards collaborative consent. And it's not just the obligation on Indigenous governments to change how they do business, but very, very clearly you can see in government how siloed and how fragmented and uncoordinated they are as well in terms of how they approach this particular issue. So that is a critical piece.
Thanks, Michael. So we've identified 7 key features or hallmarks of collaborative consent, and these are really conditions that can facilitate this type of decision making. We've sourced these hallmarks from an array of different examples on the landscape already, many of which are from the Northwest Territories context, but other examples from across BC and beyond. And so we'll illustrate the hallmarks with examples as we go. And just to be clear, each of these hallmarks is evident in current examples, but there's no one current example that we could find that has all of the hallmarks present. And again, just to be clear that these are not prescriptive or an exhaustive list, and how these hallmarks actually are manifest in different places will have to be defined by the different parties involved and their goals. So the first hallmark here is that collaborative consent is fundamentally based on trust, respect, and the art of diplomacy between governments. So it's premised on governments treating each other honorably, coming with mutual respect as partners, and each with an ability to exert jurisdiction within their own sphere. Again, a key point is this commitment not to proceed over the disagreement of their partners. And we'll come back to this in a few slides, but we're not talking about veto here. And instead, the approach is that both parties are coming, again, with this real commitment to finding mutually acceptable outcomes. But if after a very long and honest dialogue and process, agreement cannot be reached, the decision to proceed unilaterally does come at a great risk. And a decision to proceed without the support of a major partner and the cost of a damaged relationships are real considerations here. So just one example that Michael can elaborate on, Indigenous and territorial governments in the NWT were partners from the very beginning of the negotiation process for the Alberta NWT Mackenzie River Basin Bilateral Water Management Agreement. And so all parties were involved in the scoping of the interests, developing the options, and the final elements of the agreements. Michael, did you want to add some color commentary there?
Yes, Rosie, just very briefly. This didn't just happen overnight. We've been working at this literally for decades, way back into the 80s when the land claims were started to be signed with the Nubiala, with the Gwich'in, and down with the Sawtoo, and down the Mackenzie Valley. We figured out over time that if we didn't, in fact, work together, nothing would get done. And I'll elaborate more on, for example, how we started the process when we did co-drafting. But the issue is you have to recognize each other as governments and come to the table with that perspective and not keep challenging each other's authority, but look to all the work that you need to do together if you're going to build the areas where you live.
Thanks, Michael. I think that leads very nicely to the second hallmark here, which is that all governments recognize each other as legitimate authorities. So each government recognizes that the others hold jurisdiction, but importantly, they don't need to agree about the scope or the basis of that authority. No authority is given up in coming to the table, but rather each government exerts their authority in being part of the process and making decisions at the table. And so the important point here is that these processes can proceed even if there are some very fundamental uncertainties and tensions remaining, like unceded territory or unresolved land, title, and rights claims issues. And this is because, again, each party is participating based on their own understanding of their authority, regardless of whether others agree. So really, it's about not waiting for the courts to settle things before proceeding on the important governance challenges at hand. And just as an example, in the Haida Reconciliation Protocol, both the Haida Nation and the province of BC very clearly acknowledge their conflicting views with respect to some of the big ticket items like sovereignty and title and jurisdiction. But notwithstanding those competing claims, the protocol commits the parties to working together.
So, Rosie, just very quickly, as an approach of governments are far better off resolving their issues government to government. If, in fact, repeatedly you have to go to the courts, it's just a clear indication that the system as it's designed and as the one is now designed is not working because the courts are called upon to referee so much.
Thanks, Michael. The third hallmark here is that collaborative consent tables are decision-making tables. And so what this means is that representatives must have the authority to participate and make decisions. And of course, this is going to require both Crown and Indigenous nations going through their own internal processes to define who should sit on the table at their behalf and make decisions. And I think it's really important to remember here that the Indian Act for so long has imposed a system of governance onto Indigenous nations that has limited the Indigenous layers of authority, and that time and space and resourcing is going to be critical for institution building. And just as an example here, the Haida Gwaii Management Council, which emerged out of the Reconciliation Protocol, makes strategic resource management decisions, including for things like land use and forestry and conservation, and it has delegated Indigenous and Crown authority to make joint decisions at that table.
So, Rosie, just an interesting development, of course, is Treaty 5, which was signed in 1875. They had their first meeting of all the chiefs just this last week in Winnipeg to talk about, as Minister Raybould, the Minister of Justice, talked about Wilson Raybould about self-organizing and deciding what kind of governance structure Indigenous governments want to take, in this case under Treaty 5. So they've held a historic meeting to start that discussion. and Treaty 8, as well as planning and talking about holding a similar kind of gathering. So the issue of making decision-making tables is very, very important, and we're going to see some very interesting things happening in the coming years.
Thanks, Michael. That's great to have such a recent example coming forward here. The fourth hallmark here is that the scope of issues that are under consideration can be extensive and ultimately must be satisfactory to all parties. So again, collaborative consent can be applied anything from the project level all the way up to higher level law and policy development. And of course, what the process looks like, how it's designed, who's involved, will look very different depending on the place and the issue and the scale at hand. So Michael, maybe you could just speak briefly to the co-drafting process as an example of collaborative consent applied at that law development phase or scale.
All right, I'll elaborate on that on the next slide, but very, very clearly, governments will pick what's of critical importance to them, and the drafting of laws on important pieces of legislation to do with land, water, wildlife were critical in the Northwest Territories, and we were in absolute political gridlock with Indigenous governments, and nothing was moving forward on any front because of the aggravation and irritation caused by the fact that land claims had been settled in the mid-'80s, early '90s. Promises were made to redo the Wildlife Act to reflect those land claims as a major impetus, but there was no agreement on how to do that, and we were in gridlock, and we changed that, and I'll just elaborate on that in a bit.
Sounds good. The fifth hallmark is that collaborative consent starts at the very front end of a process, and all governments commit to remaining at the table for the long haul. So collaborative consent is very much a long-term and iterative and ongoing process of engagement that rebuilds trust and relationships, and it requires all governments involved to remain committed to staying at the table. So collaborative consent is never over. It's an ongoing process that spans from negotiation to implementation. And there's a great example here in BC in the Great Bear Rainforest Agreements, which was a 15-year process of negotiations to actually land at the final Great Bear Rainforest order, and there's an ongoing governance relationship committed to moving forward between the province and the nations along the coast. The sixth hallmark is that each government's interests must be dealt with in a satisfactory manner from their own point of view. So all interests are valid and welcome at the table, and no government can decide for any other government if their interest has been met. This has to be kind of self-defined. And Michael, perhaps you could speak to how this was reflected in the NWT Transboundary Water Agreements, which had to protect traditional uses of water in addition to economic interests.
So before we got to the table for the NWT Transboundary Water Agreements, there was years of concern being raised through countless meetings, assemblies about water by Indigenous governments and then the people at large in the Northwest Territories. So we spent 4 years working in partnership with Indigenous governments and the government of the Northwest Territories to develop a water strategy based on the concerns and the traditions and practices in the North with land claims and treaties. And as a result of that, we got a very, very progressive water strategy that allowed us to build off of that into the Transboundary Water Agreements. We set up an arrangement within all the Indigenous governments to have an Aboriginal steering committee that helped guide us through this process from the water strategy into the Transboundary Agreements, and we got world-class agreements that looked at traditional use and environmental flows that recognized the fact that most of the water has to stay in the aquatic ecosystems to protect the land, the water, and the animals, and that was in part largely because of we had such a unified approach.
Great, thanks, Michael. And last but not least here is that the process of collaborative consent actually generates real outcomes. So collaboration is not an end in and of itself, but rather a process to actually reach some measurable improvements on the ground and in the water. So for instance, protecting water for ecological and cultural uses, as Michael just highlighted in the NWT case, reduce conflict, etc. And I think we see some of these really concrete outcomes in the Great Bear Rainforest Agreements. For instance, designation of conservation areas, creation of a guardian watchman program. So some really tangible outcomes for the landscape and for communities from those agreements. So Michael, I'll turn it over to you if you wanted to elaborate any more on the NWT side of things.
So I would like to just quickly give you a summary overview of how we managed to do co-drafting of legislation in the Northwest Territories with all the Aboriginal or Indigenous governments. There are those that will tell you that you can't do this, but there's no legal reason why you cannot do co-drafting. None. All it takes is political will. In the Northwest Territories, land claims were settled, as I indicated earlier, in the early 80s. The Inuvialuit and then on to the Gwich'in Sahtu. There was a promise made in those agreements to bring in new wildlife legislation, because the legislation there was from the 50s and 40s and it was out of date totally. The government of the day insisted that they would do it the way it's always been done, where the government would put forth the bill and people could comment on it. And that was totally unacceptable to the Indigenous government. So for 10 years and millions of dollars going back and forth, we never moved, and it was becoming an increasing irritant, preventing us moving forward as a government as well on our own work with the federal government on devolution of powers that we wanted, because the Indigenous governments were not happy with how we were treating them. So we, in 2005, made the decision that we were not going to take the advice of the lawyers that you can't do co-drafting, and we approached Indigenous governments, and they were very, very receptive. We set up a table in 2005, and we started with the Species at Risk Act, and then we moved on to the Wildlife Act, two very big pieces of legislation. It helped build the foundation of trust, and it showed that it can be done, and we got a process that was unique that the rest of Canada could look at, and it gave us a quality of legislation that is, I think, second to none, and it allowed the Northwest Territories to move on to do devolution and address other issues like water and transboundary water agreements together, because we figured out how to get through this big intractable problem of the Wildlife Act and how you draft that bill together.
Great, thanks, Michael. So I just wanted to note briefly that in the collaborative consent report, we do outline some very specific applications of this approach in the BC water governance context. And one of those areas is in the implementation of the Provincial Water Sustainability Act. So I'm not going to go into detail here today, and so don't worry about the fine print on the slide here. But just in a nutshell, we have thought about how this approach could be applied in the context of the Water Sustainability Act, which, although is a piece of Western or colonial law and has some major shortcomings, including a lack of recognition of Indigenous water rights, we also think that there's some real opportunities to build a new relationship and apply some different approaches going forward. So just as one example, the Water Sustainability Act does include some new planning provisions known as water sustainability plans, and these can be developed to help address conflicts around water in a given region. And so, for instance, in developing a water sustainability plan, one way that collaborative consent could be applied would be for the province to explicitly recognize Indigenous nations' participation with their own laws and authority, and creating a co-chaired model from the outset, from plan development through to implementation. And so certainly, both Oliver and I would be happy to follow up with any of those who are interested to discuss some of the specifics of the Water Sustainability Act aspect. And we have just 4 key points to make, and then we'll wrap up and pass things over to Simon. So the first is that, as Michael highlighted at the beginning of this presentation, collaborative consent is not the same as consultation and accommodation. And I just want to illustrate that point with this figure here. So the triangle in the middle shows sort of the management framework for water. So at the top we have the laws, policy, and plans that really define the structure itself. And at the bottom we have project-level decisions, for instance, decisions about a water license or a mine or a pipeline that fall under those laws, policies, and plans. So Section 35, as Michael already highlighted, is very much an end-of-pipe process. So Indigenous nations are responding to proposed projects. They're really not involved in setting that bigger management framework piece at the top of the diagram there. So Crown governments decide who and how and when to talk to Indigenous rights holders. They also determine when the discussion is sufficient and deemed to be done or over. And again, at the worst case scenario, it's a process to check government power and actually justify rights infringements. Collaborative consent on the right-hand side of the diagram here starts at the very front end, so Indigenous nations are involved in the setting of the broader legal and policy foundations. Consultation and accommodation doesn't go away, but instead it really becomes a safety net. So should a collaborative consent process fail, nations are always guaranteed the extent of rights protections provided by Section 35. The second point to make here is around veto. And I know that this is a very popular concern in Canada and becomes quite polarized. And I just wanted to make a few points clear here. The first is that, in a sense, veto already does exist in the form of taking legal action. And so all parties can always use the courts to effectively block decisions, delay them, change the outcome significantly. And the second point is that a number of people who studied UNDRIP at length have really reiterated and emphasized that UNDRIP is not about only obtaining consent at a single point in time decision, but is really about building a relational approach and long-term, ongoing collaborative relationships where Indigenous peoples are involved at the very beginning in any project or process where their rights might be affected, and they're actually at the table as true partners in decision-making. And I think this reducing the conversation about UNDRIP to veto really limits the opportunity that it provides, which is to build new relationships between the Crown and Indigenous peoples going forward.
So Rosie, if I could just comment that the veto, in fact, in my mind, is a red herring. When you look at even the Canadian Constitution, the notwithstanding clause in there that provinces can turn to when they think things are really bad and they don't want to do stuff that the federal government wants to move on, is subject to challenge in the courts. So you've covered it well, that it is not a veto, but it's used as an excuse not to proceed by some parties. So I'll just roll right on to the next slide, which is not just an NWT thing. When you look at the Northwest Territories, you see the complexity there of how complicated it is, how many layers there are. It's a question of volume. Every table has these challenges. So if you could take a look at the map of Canada, you would see a very similar level of complexity across the country. Doesn't matter if you pick BC, anywhere south of 60 and over to the east, they all have their challenges, and the challenge now is for Indigenous governments and public governments to change how they do business, because they're both have systems that are not functioning properly when it comes to dealing with Indigenous people and governments. And you need to have places and people that are going to push that system to make the changes necessary, because you don't change the status quo very easily, but it is a job that can be done, and there's examples, as we've shown throughout this presentation, of how it can be done. So one of the things that's a good example of how cooperative federalism works is this chart that shows the very, very many meetings that are held between the provinces, territories, and the federal government, and as they do business. 141 major conferences over that particular year. Yet when you look at how business is done with Indigenous governments, they had one major meeting, and I think that was it. It was only for part of a day. So clearly, when you look at hallmarks, one of the hallmarks in terms of actual practice is going to be you need to have much greater communication and interaction together, like the provinces, territories, and federal government do through these very many conferences that they have come up with as a way to make cooperative federalism work. So that opportunity is there as well for Indigenous governments as we move forward with collaborative consent to interact with provinces, territories, and the federal government in a way that would allow the same kind of good work to be done. So what we have now is you have UNDRIP that is there as a broad goal. Collaborative consent has been, I think, identified and shown that it can help build long-term relationships. It can help Indigenous nations to engage, and it will allow the actual integration of approach as governments, Indigenous and public governments, to map out the way forward in their various jurisdictions and critical areas with land, water, and all economic issues, social issues. And by working together through this process, UNDRIP can become a reality. And finally, this whole issue is it is a big change, but it's not because their trail's not broken, because we can see through cooperative federalism the path that we need to take. It is the hard challenge of transforming institutions that have had 151 years of doing business in a way that is not compatible to the path taken with cooperative federalism when it comes to Indigenous governments. And it can be done. The opportunity is there right now. And by going along the path that we've already charted out in various parts of the country, we can keep moving forward on this particular change that is 151 years overdue. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Back to you, Natasha.
Okay, thank you both very much for your presentation. That was very clear and really helpful. Before we move on to Simon, I want to just raise a couple of the questions that we heard on January 15. And there was a lot of discussion, but for the sake of time, I'll highlight just a couple of the questions. And if you do want to see that other conversation, it will be captured in our summary. So the first question is to Rosie, which is a question from the audience about how can stewardship groups who don't have any authority but who are working on water, what can they do to support the implementation of this concept and build meaningful partnerships with First Nations in their watershed?
Thanks, Natasha, and I appreciated that question being raised on the earlier webinar. And I just wanted to make a couple points on that question. I think there's a lot of groups who are hoping to have Indigenous nations involved in their work, partly to build the legitimacy of the organization and in the spirit of moving forward together. But I think there's a couple of important considerations for stewardship groups and others to keep in mind. And part of that is just, has an invitation been extended and a space held for the nation's participation in this initiative? Or are nations being invited to a process that's already been kind of pre-designed? Is there flexibility in the design to kind of better accommodate some of the nation's needs and goals? So I think it's really important for any stewardship group to get to know what some of the goals are of the nations involved and how they might benefit through their participation in this collaborative initiative. I think there's some practical considerations as well, like is there capacity or flexibility that's needed to enable Indigenous participation, whether that's holding your meetings in a more convenient location, etc. So I think there's a whole host of questions that different stewardship groups can ask themselves if they're looking to partner with the nations in their watershed. And a big piece of that is just figuring out how efforts can complement and build on Indigenous nations' goals within the watershed.
Thanks, Rosie. So more of a service kind of approach to things. The second question here is more aimed towards you, Michael. One of the audience members asked about the role of traditional governance structures which are not recognized and the issue that Crown governments tend to only engage with the bodies and the leaders that they recognize and fund. What are some thoughts on that?
Well, change is coming. Minister Raybould Wilson has in fact put forward a challenge to Indigenous governments to self-organize, that while the Indigenous governments did not create the systems that currently are in place across the land or the structures of governance, they're being now asked to help solve that problem. So I think that opportunity is coming. When you look at Treaty 5, the big meeting, possibly what's happening in Treaty 8, and other moves that are afoot, but those two, when it comes to First Nations, I think the window of opportunities here, and that discussion is going to get resolved in the coming years as we build off of the support and the opportunity created by the nation to nation and implementing UNDRIP.
Thanks, Michael. Okay. Again, for the sake of time, we're going to have to move on. There were other questions, but we want to hear from Simon. And we're switching tacks here a little bit. We're going to be hearing about the approach of revitalizing Indigenous laws and traditions. And a number of communities are doing this. They're undergoing this process as part of their engagement in water governance. And this is relevant to the collaborative consent discussion because we heard about how collaborative consent involves Indigenous people being part of the conversation, the policy legal discussions really at the outset and setting the foundations of how that goes forward. So how Indigenous laws are expressed through that is really important. And Simon's just going to share what the approach looks like and help us consider how different legal orders can be applied to protect water and how they might work together. So take it away, Simon.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Michael and Rosie as well. I joined into that presentation halfway through, but I definitely agree that this is something that really fits in the work that the Indigenous Law Research Unit does with this emerging concept of collaborative consent all the way through the creation of truly representative and intersocietal legal frameworks for solving common problems. So I'm going to have a very brief introduction to ILRU. We're a research unit based at the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria, and we work directly with Indigenous communities and groups of community by invitation to articulate, restate, and help revitalize the legal principles and processes within their legal traditions and legal order. And the overall goal and vision is to support the living and the applicability in today's context and going forward of specific Indigenous legal orders, so that those might be, again, recognized, upheld, and applied as law, and do the work that law needs to do. So the context for this discussion is ILRU's continuing work. It's an ongoing project, and it's a partnership with the Environmental Law Center, also at the University of Victoria Faculty of Law. And we're working with 3 Indigenous legal orders in British Columbia to articulate their principles and processes around how water is governed and managed within their legal traditions. So those are the Lower Similkameen, the Cowichan, and the Chilcotin. And that work is ongoing, and it really is responding to both the limitations and the possibilities in the Water Sustainability Act for engaging with their own legal orders and their own deeply established and deeply grounded ways of managing the challenge and needs of human communities and non-human beings as well regarding watershed management. But I want to take a step back to talk about the challenges that we're facing and that every Indigenous legal order has had to face, and as Michael put it, for the past 151 years, and I would suggest even longer than that, Indigenous communities have had to face these still very common beliefs and misapprehensions around the law that governs their lives and that they seek to continue have govern life going forward in their territories. The first of these common beliefs is that there really was no law, and there is no law that is held by Indigenous peoples. And unfortunately, that continues to be a very common, perhaps not explicitly stated, but implicit assumption. And it's really the work of ILRU, as using this one method that I'm going to introduce, is pushing back against that sense that, well, peoples have moved on, or law only comes and is only visible when it's created by parliaments and endorsed by courts. A related common belief is that Indigenous laws really are just custom, which is these practices that over time have become legitimized and seen as the appropriate way of things getting done, but as no more than that. Of course, custom is an element in every legal tradition, including Canadian, including every colonial legal tradition. But that sense of law as no more than custom has really held people back from engaging with the finely grained and just as sophisticated nature of Indigenous legal orders. By the same token, that sense of Indigenous laws as sacred and thus not able to be developed, engaged with, challenged, changed, really inhibits the true growth, the true evolution that every legal order has to have in order to be truly effective. This is not something that is stuck in the past, and for far too long, Indigenous peoples have had to resort only to past practice to assert rights, and to be really doing the work of law. Law has to be dynamic. It has to apply to the challenges of today and every day. The final common belief that ILRU seeks to push back against is that Indigenous laws really are pan-Indigenous, and there's a single legal tradition that covers all of Canada. And of course, as Michael pointed out in that presentation, you look at the map, you look at any map, you see this very, very intricate overlay of different communities engaging with territory and having the long experience of both upholding particular legal understandings, traditions, and practices, but also engaging across communities and doing so in very sophisticated and long-standing ways. So ILRU's position is that Indigenous laws and legal traditions are more than just rules and more than just practices, but really are about the organization, the nature, and the role of law as it lives and grows and changes within society. And this is extremely challenging to relate in the context of colonialism, because there's been such distortion and such damage through this long period of denial of law, which has created these zones of failures where Canadian law has been unable to respond to the problems that and the needs of Indigenous communities, and Indigenous legal traditions themselves have been inhibited and even stated to be illegal themselves for responding to those challenges. But law, Indigenous laws, as any legal tradition, are diverse, are adaptable, have always been responsive to the issues of communities in the present. And like every legal tradition, are aspirational, they're complex, they're imperfect, and they require continual engagement, collaboration, deliberation. So the work that we do is really informed by this how. Like, we know the why, that there are these deeply rooted traditions of law and practices that have done the work of law for much longer on these territories that we call Canada than colonial legal orders have. But today, with the damage that's been done, how do those outside these legal traditions, especially, which for the most part we are, productively and respectfully engage, so that we can become these partners and these truly reconciling groups to uphold the different legal traditions in this territory. So I'm just going to take a quick look at some of the resources that can be used in the research for this work. And this is not an exhaustive list, of course, but law is held and expressed, taught and learned in many different ways. Some of those ways are accessible primarily, if not exclusively, to those who are within particular legal traditions, who are embedded through life, through kin relationships, through experience on territory and within communities. So those are some of the strongest resources for teaching and learning. For those of us who seek to engage from outside the legal tradition, we begin with those resources that have been set down, translated, transcribed and are available through published works. Those can be collections of stories, narratives. Those can also be transcripts from Canadian court processes that have involved Indigenous witnesses trying to speak within the Canadian court system what's important within their own laws. So the resources that we work with, like I said, are primarily, to begin with, these stories, narratives that have been collected, recorded over sometimes the past 100 or 200 years of this interaction with, and of course, not always a healthy interaction between those who are outside, who seek to understand the ways of those within the given tradition. And we apply our own legal skills as Canadian trained lawyers to understanding and seeking to learn about law from these resources. So a story, for example, can be a very powerful way to learn about the law. So we read stories, and we can read many stories in the course of a project to learn about some of those legal processes and principles regarding a particular question and start to outline a preliminary framework. So the phases of our methodology of a typical ILRU research project, such as the ones that we're engaged with right now for watershed management, are really starting with phase one with that specific research question, because law applies to every kind of human problem, every kind of human issue. So when we start with community, we talk about, well, what are the specific goals? What are the specific needs? In this case, it's around articulating and expressing the long-standing practices, legal practices of responding to challenges of water management, allocation, use, and also engagement within their territory, within the watershed, with other users. In this case, with immigrant, colonial governments and communities and individuals. And the next phase of our projects involves really going to those cases, which are commonly stories, legends, oral histories, and narratives, with those research questions in mind. And we do what's known in legal training as a case brief. So for every one of those resources that is identified as relevant in that collaborative process with the community that we're working with, we ask, okay, so what is the human problem this story is about? It may be a story about coyote or about raven, but really stories are about human issues and human problems. How are those stories, how are those cases resolved? What's the decision? And what are the reasons that are either explicit in the case or implicit? And to do that, and to do it in a very transparent way, so that our analysis can be checked and within our team and checked with others when we return to the community. So what we do is we develop that preliminary framework, that analysis, which includes a primer about the community and the legal tradition that we're working with, and also the beginnings of an understanding of the legal theory that animates those questions. So we start to organize the information that we're compiling in a framework that lays out the important and more finely grained aspects that can be applied to the legal questions of today. So, who are the authoritative decision makers, and in what situations would different decision makers be called upon? What are the processes by which decisions are made? What are the important principles for responding to needs? So, what should happen, and what information is required to understand what should happen in particular situations. So that preliminary framework becomes the basis by which we seek to engage with those who are inside the legal tradition, who have the much more deeply grounded substantive knowledge about how the law makes sense and how the law is coherent across particular situations and can be applied to ongoing problems. So we return to communities with that homework done and with some slightly more educated basis for asking questions. So it's not merely tell us about your law, but asking those questions that are based in the stories and the reasoning that is evident in those stories. Asking those questions. Well, how would it work in a different situation? In the case of water, for example. So what are the appropriate relations regarding a particular type of water body, for example, a lake or a creek? Are there limitations on use? Are there differences across time or across conditions, abundance and scarcity, different types of use that might be regulated, and how that's regulated? How sharing, how reciprocal relations are understood and visible on the ground, and how outsiders to a territory or visitors to a territory are engaged with regarding needs, regarding water demands. So that information, which takes the form of recorded focus groups, and then the analysis of what we learn in those focus groups, creates that integrated framework, so that the learning that our work with stories and the learning that community members have shared is integrated together. Sometimes that's explicit. A focus group will look specifically at one or more stories and talk about how the law in those stories can be understood. But often it's implicit, and the reasoning process that we undertake is for our own getting up to speed, as it were, which is not necessary, perhaps, for many of those who are already within that legal tradition. That creates the draft reports that are then returned to the community again for consultation, validation of the analysis. And then finally, and really this returns the work to communities for that work of implementation, application, both within communities and, as Rosie and Michael indicated, in that very important work between communities and the engagements that we're hoping will be much more substantive and respectful with those in the colonial legal order.
And Simon, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to kind of give you the heads up on the timing and the reminder of just a couple more minutes left. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. So this is the final report, just a little snapshot of our work with the Shortquamic. So it's not law itself, but it's like a legal memo, and it sets out the work in the different categories that can be then drawn upon to develop and grow the law. So in this case, there were 30 stories used, 23 different community voices in 10 different group interviews. So that's a bit of what we are, what we don't do, and what we're not. We don't seek to replace laws, change laws, or codify laws. The law already is living, even though living in a perhaps submerged or damaged way. What this methodology does do is analyze and organize information in that highly structured and transparent way to allow it to be more easily accessed, understood, applied, challenged, especially challenged, and then used so that it can really support that substantive, rigorous application of law that has to happen for that collaborative consent to really take root.
Thank you, Simon. And thank you again to Rosie and Michael for your presentations. You've given us a lot to think about here, and as I said, we do hope to plan a follow-up session where we can hear from some of the communities that Simon and the ILRU team have been working with and hear about their experience in this process. We're really glad that you could participate. We hope this recording is useful, and we also hope that we'll see you at our next event, not only our next Blue Dialogue session, but also our upcoming Watershed 2018 event where we can continue some of this conversation. So thank you again. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, Michael. And we look forward to talking again soon.
Thanks.
Thanks, Natasha.